I'm delighted to welcome you all to the penultimate Faculty Staff Forum of the semester, and welcome to our viewers online who are live streaming. My name is Erica Benson. I'm the Interim Director of the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing my colleague, David Tschida, who is a professor in communication and journalism and the director of our Liberal Studies program. His research interests include environmental communication and culture, and you're going to hear about some of that today when he talks about communicating heritage tourism and the environment on Minnesota's North Shore. You are in for a treat with this presentation. We'll have some time after Dr. Tschida's presentation for questions, so if you have questions, please ask them for those in the room. Those of you online, if you have a question, please email your questions. We would love to have questions from our online viewers to orsp@uwec.edu. That's orsp@uwec.edu. And our wonderful graduate assistant, Max Clark, who is also facilitating the forum, will read your questions aloud. And Dr. Tschida, if we do have questions from the audience, I would ask that you just briefly repeat the questions for the online viewers because the microphone doesn't pick up their questions very well. There will be a recording of this presentation afterwards, so feel free to let others know and share that with them. That will be on the ORSP website. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tschida.
Thank you. I want to begin today by talking a little bit about what inspired this particular work. So in the early summer of 2019, I received in an email Kathy Rex and Siobhan Watson, Kathy Rex from English, Siobhan Watson formerly from our English department, their call for a book chapter on heritage tourism. And immediately the thought of the project connected to at least a portion of where my research interests are with environment and culture. That week, I was headed to the International Environmental Communication Association's Conference on Communication and the Environment. And while at that conference, some of my colleagues and presenters there were talking about the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. And that to get into this park, there's really one major road. And their interests were in how the history of segregation had impacted who uses that park. And they noted that on the long road drive into this park, the number of hateful messages, Confederate flags, other kinds of symbols that were seen that might be less than inviting to a diverse audience using that particular park. And that got me thinking, while I was still interested in the book proposal, of the trip that I had planned 1 week after I got back from the conference to travel with friends along the North Shore of Minnesota, spending most of our time at the resort at Lutsen in Minnesota. And so all of that conspired together, worked together to lead to the chapter that I have in Kathy Rex and Siobhan Watson's book, Public Memory, Race, and Heritage Tourism of Early America. So this area is an area of what I call convergence. The idea of heritage tourism converges with ideas and issues of indigeneity, of culture, of environment and nature, and of settler colonialism. So Grand Portage National Monument is way up here in the upper corner of Minnesota. It borders the lake and it borders the Canadian border. So it's right up in there in that tiny, tiny tip of Minnesota in the area called the Arrowhead. And it's the home to the Anishinaabe people. And the Grand Portage National Monument, which is the focus of my attention, is situated on the Grand Portage Reservation. So I make the argument in this chapter that visiting the monument is not a visit that begins when you pull off Highway 61 into the road, into the community of Grand Portage and the monument that's located within that community, that in fact your gateway to the monument starts 150 miles down the road here in Duluth. And I make that argument because for the vast majority of travelers to do anything along Lake Superior, the trip begins in Duluth. There are no major roads or any other access points along this 150 miles. A couple small county or one small state road, but this is not going to be bringing in any significant numbers of tourists to the Lake Superior region or the shoreline kind of area. So that a visit to Grand Portage National Monument and the context for understanding Grand Portage National Monument as a tourist experience really begins there in Duluth. Along the way from Duluth to Grand Portage, there are 7 state parks. There are numerous resorts, restaurants, other kinds of attractions. There are the history and the places and the communities that have dealt with European American sort of extractive communities. So whether that be fish harvesting from the lake, that could be logging, and that could be the iron ore mining that occurred in the Arrowhead region, this region here, and that ore was brought to Lake Superior to eventually be shipped to places like Pittsburgh for the production of steel. So this area, kind of tongue-in-cheek, gets called the Norwegian American Riviera, which is in some ways very fitting because the architectural style of communities, the history of a Scandinavian influence in the region is quite obvious. And as I noted a moment ago, this area is referred to the Arrowhead itself area, or the Iron Range, and the North Shore. So it has these 3 different kinds of names for the different purposes or parts of this particular region. So Grand Portage Monument does not stand alone as a text, something that we can read and interpret and make sense of, because no tourist arrives at that monument without experiencing all the places along the highway there first, without pulling on their education and their understanding. If you're a Minnesotan who is educated on the history of the state and the Arrowhead region or those kinds of areas. They draw on family stories, whether those are stories of your parents or your grandparents vacationing along Lake Superior, or the number of people who might have generations before them that were a part of the extractive industries, and maybe now they live in the Twin Cities or other kinds of places. So what comes before along that highway drive shapes what comes to or what's experienced and how Grand Portage National Monument is experienced. And Grand Portage National Monument is not designed to have itself stand alone. Its position on the map challenges that kind of thing, and there is an embracing, I think, in the monument of that gateway experience, that they are mindful of the 150 miles it took visitors, tourists, to get to their location. So like the fur traders of more than 200 years ago, the tourist is very specifically and intentionally positioned as a voyager to the North Shore and to the monument, which becomes this apt metaphor for the particular experience. So I only briefly want to highlight my methodology in looking at this research because it contextualizes what I'm doing. I use cultural discourse analysis, which mixes together for me some autoethnography and my own reflection on what I'm experiencing, some elements of ethnography, and certainly elements of rhetorical analysis, which could be looking at what's occurring on signs and placards and stuff in visitor centers, the video materials that are displayed to tourists or that are, that you can purchase at the monument itself, those sorts of things. And in looking at all of that and then thinking about my experience, I'm concerned about the everyday cultural practices that are occurring. And tourism is an everyday kind of cultural practice. It's a type of discourse, and we are communicated to about how to be a tourist. In being a tourist, our behaviors and our actions are communicative. And so these practices, these things that we're encountering together blend to offer us insight into how people are asked to or led to or from what resources they draw from to make sense of this particular experience. So as a tourist and as a scholar, and having those two things come together and blend, cultural discourse analysis is what occurring when I, as this tourist, look at materials that I encounter at one state park versus the next state park, on a website for a state park, these different places, and realize that, for example, the spellings of indigenous names for Lake Superior or even for the indigenous people themselves change. There might be more or fewer letters in the spelling. And I learn as a scholar that this represents, the linguistic differences in different language patterns for different communities that were along the lake, tribal communities that were along the lake, different cultural norms and community norms and variations in that sense. So if my fellow tourists are mindful of seeing these differences along that route, they too are engaging in a kind of small-scale cultural discourse analysis of thinking about what this means or why they're encountering those differences and what the implications might be for their own particular experiences. Cultural discourse analysis also makes me mindful of sensory experiences in particular places, and much of my research, not just this particular study, is interested in how listening occurs. Listening not just as someone else speaks to me, or listening, if we use that metaphor, as my reading strategies or interpretive strategies of what I encounter in a placard, but listening to the waves slosh along the shore of the resort where I'm at, listening to nature in other ways. So if I ask the question, who speaks for nature, or how does nature speak to me, my use of listening, or my mindfulness about what listening means, becomes broader in the sense that I can conclude that nature does speak. And so as a research strategy, I work to incorporate indigenous scholars and indigenous methodologies in this project, or indigenous scholars using comparative methodologies, in my effort to maybe help to decolonize the practices of heritage tourism. All right, a little bit about the monument itself. Grand Portage National Monument preserves the late 1700s and early 1800s fur trade site for the British Northwest Company. And you see the recreated, rebuilt fort here. On the hill up above the fort, you can see it's situated here. There would have been other buildings around the periphery of the wall that protected the fort. And then Lake Superior situated there. So the river is the current border between Canada and the United States and Minnesota, and Grand Portage reflects on, or is named on, that particular river and the portage that had to occur to move canoes and fur and other things around, and in a moment I'll show you that. So the Northwest Company selected this particular site for their fort because it was easy to build, a nice flat piece of land here. And if you went out into the water and around this point, you come back to where the river is. And that river, the Pigeon River, like I said, is the border between the United States and Canada, perhaps all the way to about International Falls. So you're going like half of the Minnesota border. And then there are additional waterways, rivers, lakes, small portages that allowed the voyagers, the fur trappers, to move extensively through much of Minnesota and much of Canada. So here you see the falls itself. There was a 9-mile trek. So voyagers, here you see some tourists on one stand, and this photographer who's taking this picture is on the upper stand. You see the falls themselves. It was a 9-mile trek to get around this particular falls. So you would have come up the river at most probably about a space right down here, and then would have had to come up the hill and around and follow more falls and stuff like that to get around this particular area. These falls are 120 feet, the fall of the water, which is the largest or highest waterfall in the state of Minnesota. So the National Park Service manages the monument itself, but it sits within and is under the control of the Grand Portage Reservation. And few of our national monuments, there are maybe 4 or 5 total, have this kind of partnership between the National Park Service and indigenous communities. And as my research tells me, the efforts that happen at Grand Portage or at those other places are typically quite labor intensive to try to get around and beyond the issues of settler colonialism and the injustices and the mistrust that might have occurred in the past. So at the monument itself, you have the fort, and you see this part here that the National Park Service is monitoring and controlling and in care of. And then you see the visitor center or the heritage center that the tribal community there manages. So the National Park Service has a very Eurocentric story of the fur trade that it creates within the monument. And the Grand Portage Band tells their cultural narrative in the Heritage Center and on a path that leads from this Heritage Center to the outside walls of the fort itself. And this is where, at the Heritage Center, a tourist experience would typically intimately begin with going inside and learning about what's there and around. From the Heritage Center, you're unlikely to see, maybe now in fall with the leaves off the trees, the fort itself. So you'd go in, learn about, like, where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do? What's this space about? Get that information, and then you could wander down a trail through a little bit of poplar grove and woods to get to the fort itself. Adding to the dual partnership that exists here, that waterfall that I showed you is part of Grand Portage State Park. So the tribal community also has a partnership with the state of Minnesota and its state park service and its state park program, so that the state park manages, in some ways, the falls, and there's another visitor center that the community, the indigenous community here, manages at the park. So the indigenous Native American heritage tourism has received some scholarly attention in areas such as museum studies and how voice is incorporated into those experiences, particularly the voices of the indigenous communities being represented there at the park. And so my efforts are mindful of this idea of how voice is being expressed, and that's where that ethnographic part of my study and some of the rhetorical work comes in. So here you see a picture of the Heritage Center itself. The Heritage Center strategically frames Grand Portage National Monument to emphasize the indigenous culture and history. It's very much an Anishinaabe narrative, and it's not done in some sort of third person or people of the past kind of narrative structure, which is so typical in other places. Here it's done telling a story where Grand Portage is a very vibrant kind of community. So that gives you a little bit of the background kind of information you need, and so now you have to sort of imagine me as the tourist, wanting to have my autoethnographic experience and wanting to interpret this experience that I have along the way. And having been along the North Shore many times before, on this particular trip, I strategically choose the particular sites that I'm going to visit this time that I'm there, because I've been there so many different times. And I want to note that in a little bit of irony or weirdness or whatever it is here, that my slides and my presentation should not represent tourism, because it annoys the bejesus out of me. The sort of get out of your car, run towards whatever you want to take a picture of. You don't even stop to look at it. You're just snapping the pictures, and you get back in your car and drive away. But there's a weird sort of comparison to trying to summarize in a short amount of time my research. So it's sort of like those same snapshots that are occurring before you jump back in the car to go on your way. So I would start this trip with my first stop being Gooseberry Falls State Park, which was created in 1937 It was founded to ensure that all economic classes across Minnesota would have a place for tourism along the North Shore. Pretty noble intention right there. Its website, and I should note that like most tourists, I was also examining the websites because if I was new or wanted to know something different about the parks, before I got there in the car or before I left home, I probably would have looked at websites, so I have to factor in how those impact a tourist experience. Their website describes this area as having human use, starting with the Cree, the Dakota, and the Ojibwa. And the river appears on European maps, the river that you see there that's part of the falls, starting in 1670. The signage in the park tells me that commercial fishing in Lake Superior, which will be down here ways, began in 1870, and logging of white pine and other timber occurred starting in the 1890s in this area. I stop at Tateguchi State Park, which was founded in 1979, and it's known for its prominent cliffs, some waterfalls and things as well, but it's really known for those prominent cliffs. A sign in the visitor center displays the Ojibwa name, Gichigami, or Big Water, for Lake Superior. And interestingly, sadly, nothing at the park recognized that Ojibwa people still live in this area, that they're still present. So there's this sense of disconnect that occurs for perhaps a tourist experience at this park. I stop at the Temperance River State Park, which had some of its buildings built as part of the Civilian Conservation Corps work in the 1930s, but became a state park in 1957. I hike here for a while with my wife. Signage in the park, for good reason, warns against diving, climbing on the rocks, or off-trail hiking. I will note that I still saw diving from the rocks and swimming in the waters and off-trail hiking. And I make the argument that part of that is maybe just the adventurous experience that is part of some of our personalities, but also that is now an ingrained, hopefully changing, but ingrained sort of part of an experience of these parks because, well, mom and dad did that, or that's their stories of doing it, or that's sort of what generations of folks did. So that lingering element of those experiences still exists there. The message on websites at this park and other kinds of parks, the visitor centers, those kinds of things, for these parks, the generational stories that are often told mostly speak to indigenous peoples who were once here. But for the most part, there's this sense that they were never really established here as communities, that maybe they themselves also were just voyagers of the moment. And that thus there were valuable resources that were just waiting to be extracted. That lumber, that fish, or I make the argument that even tourism now is an extractive kind of enterprise that is going on here. So the settler colonialism saw the Iron Range, the Arrowhead region for its ore, and today those extraction industries are now tourist attractions themselves as well. There's the Hull Rust Mine, which is the largest open pit mine in the world and referred to as the Grand Canyon of the North. And there is the Sudan Underground Mine, which is part of a state park, and you can go down and see where the underground versus the open pit mining was occurring and what that looked like. Other few things quickly along here. If you've been along this area before, you have probably stopped at Betty's Pies, because that's what they are known for, is having 30, 40 pies on the menu, and then you can stop and have a burger or fries or something like that. There's Lutzen Resort here, and that's where I was staying on this particular trip. And as a side note, my wife and I were married right on the beach here on the other side of these trees. So it's a fond place for us. And I have two pictures there at the bottom of the community of Grand Marais, one of the more significant resort communities or resort towns along this area. So I want to start with this idea of a sense of place, because place is foundational to tourism, and it's foundational to our relationships with the environment. Place sustains us. It satisfies our spirit. It might ground us. It might unite us with others. Place might captivate us, and it's, when we see the cliffs or a waterfall. place often is about then what we find personally most salient or significant in a location. It's about what we do in and how we relate to those particular locations. So for us, for me as the tourist, it is along the North Shore, this kind of cumulative experience that's occurring. That all these things add together, they mix together, they influence one another, they shape the kind of experience that I'm having. And so there's some sense of what happens in one place is permitted in another. And what I mean by that is how you might approach your interaction with Tateguchi State Park and whether or not you should dive from the cliffs. Does that lead you to arrive at Grand Portage National Monument and think you might be able to walk wherever you may? How do those sorts of patterns of behavior carry over and get transferred from one place to another as a part of the total tourism experience occurring in this area? So my first stop here then, visiting the Grand Portage Reservation, is to go to the state park, because that will be the furthest thing north. From the parking lot out in front of this building here, the visitor center, you can actually see the post that you have to stop at, you know, if you want to show your passport and transfer into Canada. It is right at the border. And the visitor center tells the narrative of a great carrying space, obviously getting around that particular falls. And it notes how Anishinaabe children are grounded in their culture and family clans. And we see representations of the clans and the culture in signage around the top here that is outside. And there's a tension in this visitor center on the grandmother earth and on Nanabuzu, the so-called great nephew of the Anishinaabe people, who saved all the animals during a great flood by using a log and then creating Turtle Island as a kind of safe space. And in being here at this moment and thinking about my own behavior and mindfully watching what other tourists were doing as we all stood collectively in this room, I wonder how many people in reading this sort of creation story are linking it to creation stories in their own religious traditions. And I'm wondering the connection that they're making between, you know, the great carrying place and the great carrying place, and you know, Noah's Ark is the great carrying place, and how all of those kinds of stories and those narratives for our different cultural experiences have this kind of commonality together. These heritage discourses, like we see in this one that's displayed in much more detail on the wall there, are political discourses in that they represent different ideologies, different myths, elements of nostalgia, elements of marketing to draw tourists to these places, so that they help to further or support this idea that tourism is this commodity that can be extracted from a particular location. These discourses are contested. They are things that we struggle over and disagree over and have conflicts between cultures over. And at times, because the narratives mix and the telling of narratives and the experiencing of them, it becomes hard to know who should control those narratives. Who do they really belong to? So in heritage tourism, then, there's this idea that some minoritized communities communicate these discourses into the public sphere as maybe a part of their community's survival, and that's a public sphere that's only partially of their making and only partially and probably not too significantly under their control that they're trying to participate within. So in a sense of place, and here you see some photos from inside the Heritage Center at the monument. At the monument, I'm welcomed with a Voyager sign, greetings, buzu, bonjour. I encounter information on the Voyagers, the canoes, the fur trade, a diorama of what the trading post would have looked like in 1797. I encounter displays on Gitche Omengami, the community, as home to the Grand Portage Band, and the North Shore as the home to Anishinaabe people. There are display cases that exhibit artifacts going back to the 1850s. And for me, what is really striking, particularly displays such as this one, and there are many of them that are like the one that you see there, is how familiar the choice of what's put into these display cases is seemingly, resonating with me. These museum quality displays contain very personal items from members of the community. So it makes the community very relatable. It's as if I'm looking through someone's scrapbook, or I found some, grandmother's trunk that I've opened up, and here are all the family heirlooms that are within that. It's all there for me to see. And so I wonder then how many tourists make similar kinds of connections to their own stories and experiences. I wonder how they think about what this all means about, or to the people who are there at the moment. At this point, right here, you can sit on these benches that they have here, and if you look inside the wigwam here, there is a TV monitor that you can activate by pressing a button here and watch a display inside. And I watch a video where a woman and a voyager are seated. She is looking out towards the camera. We are looking over his shoulder. And she explains that the voyagers were strong, that they were fearless, but they were poorly prepared to survive in this environment. It was the women of this community who taught the voyagers to survive and how to trade. The voyager that we see on the screen, and thus the tourist who's positioned as voyager, is never attacked in this dialogue, never blamed for hardships that Indigenous people would experience. As a tourist, I'm positioned via the video to appreciate the fur trade. And I'm positioned to appreciate the experience of the tribal community in that fur trade. So I encounter these elements and things that are a part of the experience. There is, up here, there's a lot of local art that's displayed, and it's a rotating basis there that you can see some of the artwork of community members. So I'm going to not talk significantly about having the tourist experience that is put on by the National Park Service. Here's inside, this is the building here. I'm seeing inside the large table for the elite members of the fur trade. And then there would have been other lesser tables that the voyagers themselves would have sat at. Here you see some voyagers recreated there. Obviously you see the tourists there. This would have been the kitchen supplying and feeding all the men who would have been in the main building. I'm going to focus instead on the visitor center, and at this point turn to the video that plays, and if you visit many sites, there's maybe a half-hour or 20-minute video that plays. I'm going to focus on that next here. So the last thing I do is watch this 25-minute video playing at intervals in the Heritage Center Theater. It's a valuable text for understanding the Indigenous perspective that's occurring there. We are told how the narratives of the people are grounded in this place for generations. This is a far different story than we're used to hearing in other kinds of places and breaks particular kinds of stereotypes. The person that is the main, we have a narrator who we never really see. The main character, the protagonist that we see, is the same woman who was in the wigwam that was in the visitor center, and she is then referred to as a trading woman. We hear about her particular experience. We hear about the effects of alcohol and smallpox. We hear about the treaty between the United States and Britain. And all this time, the tourist and visitor is never blamed. It's the United States government, it's the treaties that were signed between the United States and Britain where blame is placed. I think my tourist experience here probably matches other tourists, so it allows me to draw three conclusions I want to talk about right here. First deals with identity, that the positioning of me as a voyager is powerful, but not ever being blamed and then being in some ways released of responsibility, I think opens up a receptivity to the community that could include emotions of sympathy and connection, could include support for the tribal community, and perhaps other resources that are, or other things that are there. There's a casino, there's a hotel, there are other things that are a part of this experience here. Second, I think that the voice of the Anishinaabe people is really significant in how it's put forth here, because of the uniqueness of this particular site and what they're able to do to express voice. And third, I think that by strategically blaming the United States government and not the tourists / people / citizens that are Europeans that are coming here, it really does allow for a reimagining of tourist experiences along the entire lakeshore. And what we encounter in the ways we treat the environment, perhaps more mindful to indigenous points of view, the ways that we think about the extractive industries, et cetera. So I think that this model could really be useful to others who want to work in heritage tourism centered around indigenous communities. And that's my presentation in the snapshots.
For questions?
Go ahead.
Yeah. You mentioned that the trip actually begins in Portage, and that 150-mile travel sort of primed you for the ultimate experience.
Yep.
So as a thought experiment, if you could have magically been helicoptered to the Grand Portage National Monument, how do you think your experience there would have differed from the actual experience of traversing those 150 preliminary miles?
I think part of it would be how I interact with the fort or the trading post, because if diving off a cliff or walking off a trail, going your own way through the park is something you can choose to do there, how violating of the rules might I be because I had to have the 150 miles, and if I don't have that 150 miles, is my tourist behavior any better? And and that could include being in the fort. That could include, to get that, one of the earlier views of the fort was situated high above and you saw down upon the fort. Well, there's a trail on that hill you can climb up. Do I stay on that trail? Do I take the shortcut because it looks a little easier? What sorts of things am I going to do in that particular way? Likewise, in our Western tradition here in the United States, North America, as we treat indigenous folks, we've made them part of landscape. So in making them part of landscape, they are more so part of landscape on that 150 miles than if I arrive there at the community and get to experience them more directly that way. I'm experiencing the culture that directly. So I think there would be a change in how I see the indigenous communities, and maybe to further your thought experiment, if I could even set aside education and all the bad westerns and all those kinds of things that I might have experienced beforehand that have also situated my approach to the park. So that's partially how I might think of answering that question, is just that I would come with less baggage or different baggage to the experience of the park.
So you said that sort of by absolving the visitor of like blame or guilt, that in some ways that opens us up to maybe sympathy or connection, but do you think that maybe there's a, like, what's lost by basically removing any sort of confrontation there?
David, I'll ask if you can repeat that.
Yeah, what's lost by having the tourist not have to feel an obligation? I think what's lost is maybe more so for the tourist and having that responsibility than it is for the needs of this community. It's a, I can say, and I say this in the sense that it's a very impoverished community, reliant on the tourists who are coming to see the monument, reliant on folks who, if they want to go to a casino, have driven 150 miles to get to a casino. And there is a casino just to the south side of Duluth that is indigenous operated. So this community is so in need of a tourist experience to survive right now that I think to all the ways that my guilt could be useful to their betterment, if my guilt or the kind of the tourist guilt leads to me not wanting to stick around, not wanting to spend my dollars at the casino, not wanting to be there, the poverty increases, the sense of the disconnect increases, because even from Grand Marais, sort of what might be for many people the last stop on the route there, it's like another 40 miles beyond Grand Marais to get there. So it's a very, very purposeful tourist intention to get to Grand Marais. And so I would probably more eloquently, with more time, try to think about those kinds of issues of how that the community suffers if they use a blame obligation narrative versus how they, in not using that, find ways to thrive in my being there. But I should, as tourist, still have to wrestle with some things. I'm not asked to wrestle with it right there. And really, I'm in many ways not anywhere along the route with the extractive industries and tourism tied to those kinds of things.
Last question?
Thank you.
Thank you.